Hey guys, it's Zach here, and today we're going to discuss the Euthyphro Dilemma, and we're also going, if you stick around to the end of the video, we're also going to try and figure out what Socrates and Plato thought about the death penalty. Before we can come to understand the Euthyphro Dilemma, first we must discuss some of the ways that ancient Greece is different from the modern world we live in. You see, although some people like to think of Western culture as a long, unbroken chain spanning from Greece to modern America, it really isn't. And a modern American transported back to ancient Greece would be just as lost as a person who landed on a planet full of Martians. So, we've got to discuss some of the relevant history and some of the psychology that goes into some of their thoughts and practices for the Euthyphro Dilemma to really make sense. The crux of the dilemma is this. Is something pious because it's loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it is pious? Do all pious things share some form of piousness? In our modern world, we don't think about these things as often because, we don't have a pantheon of gods that we worship. We don't have a bunch of gods with disagreeing opinions that we try and satisfy one, but maybe we anger the other, or try to satisfy the other and anger the first one. But the Greeks did. So this was a very serious question for them. And in our modern times, the question can be rephrased as something like, are just things just because we love them, or do we love just things because they are just? And that's a question that is still kind of debated. However, Plato gives us a good and solid answer to that, and we'll cover that after we talk a little bit more about the differences between ancient Greece and the modern world. In ancient Greece, this was a society that still held slaves. This was a society where not all people had equal rights. This was a society where modern science and the scientific method did not exist. So if you're a farmer living in ancient Greece, one year maybe you have a very bountiful harvest. The next year, maybe it's a famine. Maybe you don't have a good harvest and you're left wondering how you're going to be able to eat. But as a simple farmer, maybe you don't know what has caused that difference from year to year. You don't know that it's a change in weather patterns, or you don't know that maybe your soil is not as fertile because you've been growing the same crop, you haven't been doing crop rotation. So the Greeks tried to answer a lot of these questions by appealing to higher powers. Why is there a famine this year? Because so-and-so didn't do the proper sacrifices. Why was this year bountiful? Because so-and-so prayed extra hard to the gods. So for the Greeks, questions of piousness and righteousness were much more serious than they are today. In fact, in modern times, if you call someone pious, there's a bit of a tone of insult to the word. Someone's overly pious, maybe a zealot. But in modern times, to be pious, that was a great compliment. That was an honorable thing. And the Euthyphro Dilemma deals with Socrates meeting a young priest named Euthyphro, who is on his way to indict his father on a lawsuit because his father killed a man who had killed one of their slaves. Euthyphro feels that the father was wrong because they should have waited for someone to get back from the temples with an answer of what should have been done. The father let the murderer die due to exposure by tying him up and throwing him out in a ditch. The world of ancient Greece was a place where you couldn't necessarily depend on the cops or the town guards to come and protect you. You couldn't necessarily depend on law courts to treat you justly and fairly. So a lot of times justice was dealt out by those that were nearest to the crime or nearest to the situation. They did have law courts and they did have prison and guards, and in fact Socrates himself gets convicted of corrupting the youth and sentenced to death. But it was much less institutionalized and much less official than what it is today. So as we can see, piousness was very important to the Greeks, and within the idea of piousness, justice is included to some extent. The idea of justice within Plato's dialogues takes a very prominent role throughout a large number of his dialogues as he continues to exhort his interlocutors to try and describe what justice is and how justice can be implemented in the world. Within the Euthyphro, the text, at some point they come to the agreement that Piousness includes justice and right actions towards the gods, whereas justice on earth includes justice and right action towards people. So that they do kind of make a little bit of a split. Piousness deals only with the gods. However, the things that you do for the gods don't benefit them. You cannot bring benefit to the gods because they're immortal, all-knowing beings. Whereas, your justice on earth can bring benefit to humans. At some point in the text, Socrates and Euthyphro define piety as a sort of trading skill between humans and gods, where humans offer up sacrifices and to try and give things to the gods, and humans offer up prayers to try and receive things from the gods. However, Socrates notes that in itself is not pious. That's an instantiation of piousness. So the dialogue ends with no resolution to the problem. However, in Plato's other text, he does offer a resolution to the problem of what is piety. Piety, within Plato's metaphysics, as described in the Theaetetus, the Phaedrus, the Phaedo, the Republic, the Parmenides, piety is a form. It's a simple idea that exists up above humans. And how we connect with this idea of piety is not through learning about it in school. It's through a type of recollection that our souls have, our immortal souls have, as they've been put back into bodies here on earth. Within Plato's worldview, when a person dies, they transcend up into the world of the forms, where they can get a taste of the pure forms, these pure and perfect ideas. But then after some time up there with the forms, they'll come back down to earth. And with that, with their coming back down to earth, they'll bring some of that knowledge with them whenever they get ensouled in a new body. So so for Plato, knowing something is a type of recollection that comes throughout one's life as one partakes in dialogue and partakes in education. You're not actually learning things. It's not new knowledge getting imprinted on a tabula rasa. It's a reconnection with ideas that you've seen before in a past life. So, throughout all of his dialogues, when Plato has Socrates asking people, what is piety? What is justice? What is honor? What is friendship? He's not expecting them to give him a answer of piety is X, Y, and Z. He's trying to lead them towards the idea that piety is a sort of simple form that exists above us that we connect with through recollection. This is also something that's seen very heavily throughout the Meno. Throughout the dialogue in the Meno, Plato really talks heavily and hammers home this idea of recollection. As you go through life, you can recollect things that you have not formally learned. So with all that prior stuff stated and laid out before us, the Euthyphro Dilemma is not so much of a dilemma as it might seem at first. Pious things are loved by the gods because they are pious. Pious things are not pious because they are loved by the gods. See, within Plato's metaphysics, these simple forms and the gods are somewhat co-located. You see this within the Timaeus, that the Greek gods live up among these simple forms. Now, for some of us, that can create a dilemma, especially if we're looking at Greek mythology and Greek history. You can say, well, does this mean that the forms are more powerful than the gods, or that the gods are subservient to the forms? And that was a problem that even Plato struggled with in his own time. You see throughout the Timaeus, and particularly the Parmenides, that he tries to kind of like resolve these things, but he does run into problems trying to lay this out specifically. Later thinkers such as Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, who looked at it from more of a Christian perspective, they solved the problem by saying, well, the forms themselves exist within the mind of an omnipotent God. So there is no instance of, is this loved by X because of X? From the Neoplatonist perspective, when one does a just thing or a pious thing, they're participating within the form as it's kind of translated down into the material world. They're participating in, you know, what you might call a godly action. However, within Plato's own metaphysics, that's not necessarily the case. So as we can see, pious things are pious not because they're loved by the gods, but because they participate in the form of piousness. Now, you might ask, well, what does that even mean? We've had this long discussion, but we've still not defined what piousness actually is. Well, see, that's the kind of trick with Plato's metaphysics. Here in the material world in which we live, we cannot know what the actual nature of the forms are. You know, they exist above and beyond us in the same way that, you know, Plato and Socrates couldn't know what the exact nature and desires of the gods were. Because, you know, for a human within the material world, you know, the gods, the simple forms, they're above and beyond our current comprehension. Because as we exist as human beings, we're material and ensouled bodies. Plato believes that by living a reflective philosophical life, we can kind of cut ourselves off from our material nature and in some cases connect to these higher forms. But it's not completely successful until after one has died and moved on to the next realm of existence. And even then, just due to our nature, it's not permanent. In most cases, we're going to come right back down and get ensouled in bodies again. So, now let's get to the question that I know has been burning in your mind as well as mine. What do we think that Plato and Socrates thought about the death penalty and thought about justice as a type of punishment which ends a human life? Well, based off of the text of the Phaedo, as well as Socrates' own views on justice expressed throughout the early dialogues and his own views on justice expressed, Plato's own views on justice expressed throughout the later dialogues, I don't think Plato had a problem with the death penalty. And even in the case of Euthyphro, had a problem with Euthyphro's father killing the person that had murdered one of their slaves. Because again, we have to understand that justice, as Plato views it, is not always instantiated with, you know, courts and trials. Sometimes justice is instantiated in other ways. Sometimes justice can be instantiated between private individuals. Additionally, as we see within the Phaedo and within the Minnow, Socrates, after he's convicted and put on trial to, to receive the death penalty, he does not run from it, and he views it as him, as a member of society, participating in the desires of the society. If this video has really piqued your interest on Plato and Plato's metaphysics, I did a fast philosophy video explaining Plato's forms. This has been Euthyphro, and I'll see you in the future.